small NGOs, centers for investigative journalists that started to pop up around Eastern Europe. It was an agreement to publish in the same time, or even to wait for the other reporters in the different country to publish, where there was no immediate danger that somebody would intervene to stop the story, so that we could republish the story and say, you know, it was a collaborative work, but it was also already published in another country. It's already public. So you could not stop this story. Pressure would be worthless. And it would be bad publicity for the people trying it. So basically that was the start. It was a sort of, as I said, a move that we made out of the need, lack of publication platforms, independent publication platforms. Back then it was paper. We started our website that still looks awful now, our Romanian website. We started in 2002.
How did you finance it?
Well, we did freelance work for Western Media, and we put our own money into the platform and the sort of small operation that required some sort of IT expertise, server, and accountant. So it was our own money, and it still is mostly. We diversified in a way from the freelancing model where we put the money we make into this independent platform, so that we keep an archive of our stories, so that in the long run people will come to us because they will find stories that we did about a company or a person that they are interested in. And we diversified in the last 10 years by going toward grants and foundations money or EU money, but this I think was a really big mistake that we are trying to fix now, because with a very small team, all you end up doing is trying to fundraise and write grant proposals, and also going towards what other people would like to see investigated, and not what you really feel you should do. So the money, it's still a big issue, right? And it becomes a big issue in Western Europe and the US in the last years, as far as I can tell. But it was never, we never had the luxury to work for a media that would support us to only focus on the investigative stories. So yeah, that was the start, and I think we focused in the first few years to break big stories in Romania, and then we kind of had a cross-border approach in Eastern Europe. Next step was to work for the big media in order to establish ourselves, because no matter how big the stories are you publish at home, there is almost no impact. And there is also little credibility with existing publication platforms. So our idea was, well, if we publish in tandem with BBC or other big media around Europe, then we can build a portfolio and trust. And we focused in the last 2 or 3 years on trying to find a sustainable model for us to do this, because, as I said, the grant money and foundation money, it's not an option for us, not the way things look right now. And
are you publishing though in print or on the internet only?
No,
or?
we publish on our platforms, and then we usually have a partner, either in Romania or abroad or both, or in other countries in Eastern Europe as well. Depends on the story. So for instance, there was a big story on a German karate teacher living in Romania for 10 years and offering karate classes for kids in the villages in Romania. I did this story with Toronto Star in Canada. And it turned out this teacher living in Romania for 10 years, he was previously in jail in Germany for pedophilia, and he was actually secretly filming kids in Romania and selling that stuff through a Canadian website. That was a research for Toronto Star, but then we did the local versions for local media in Romania and for national media in Romania and also for Moldova, and we also had a version of it in English on the Black Sea, which is good because Toronto Star is behind a paywall, so now if you want to see the full story a year ago, you only have our Black Sea platform to read the whole thing with the names and so on. So we publish always in partnerships, and actually we realize that our platforms are very small, so and we can't have a sort of daily operation. So we use this partnership also to use the established media as an amplifier for our stories, an amplifier that we can't really have. And so we focused in the last 3 years in sort of expanding towards new platforms and experimenting with what works. So that's why we created the Black Sea project, the Black Sea publication platform. The idea is we won't ever have advertisement on it. The idea was to have sort of in-depth research from the region and authors to build their portfolio there, to be found, and to be able to get freelance jobs in the long run.
Yeah.
And then we started the Sponge Media Lab, where we work with others, coders, even activists, legal experts, because you gave the example of WikiLeaks and offshore leaks and all this other stuff. We don't have the tech capacity, or we can't afford to pay a data team. So we work with coders based on projects, and we worked on experiments, hackathons, meetings, whatever. And when we have a problem like analyzing a huge batch of data, we know where to turn to and start from there. Yeah.
Good. Craig, yourself, because you've had connections with Black Sea.
Sure.
Tell us about it.
So my name's Craig Shaw. I'm actually a journalist, a fellow at the Centre for Investigative Journalism, so Gavin is sort of my boss. My background is sort of different. So while Stefan was kind of at the forefront of establishing cross-border journalism in Europe, I think, when I came out of university, this stuff was already really well known, and it was these people who were doing the most exciting stuff. I never particularly had an interest in UK politics, or it was these guys and ICIJ who seemed to be doing the stuff that was most interesting to me. So I did a bunch of kind of small stuff with Duncan Campbell, who I worked with for a while, and then I became involved in Offshore Leaks. And we published, I think, 12 stories or something that came out of that, that were related to a number of countries. And really that's how, at least half of my work is cross-border in some way. I work a lot with European, because I guess when Stefan started, there weren't really that many non-profit investigative journalism platforms in Europe or elsewhere. There were some in the US, I think, but so that's sort of how I met Stefan on Offshore Leaks, and then things tend to sort of grow from there. There are, of course, these big networks like ICIJ that kind of co-opt people to be officially members, but most of the cross-border work, I think, happens between smaller groups of people who...
Can you say what ICIJ is?
Yeah, can you tell us what it is?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
ICIJ is the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. It's kind of a sub-organization of the Center for Public Integrity in Washington. And it is a member organization that its remit was to pick the best journalists in each country and bring them together so that when you had a cross-border story, you could pick the best person in that country. Recently, that's kind of changed because they have these huge data projects that involve, 100 journalists in 100 countries. And that's kind of the model I think that most people recognize. Like if you look at cross-border investigations, you kind of come up with things like that. Where was I? So that's really how I got started. And then you meet somebody that proves trustworthy, and then your network kind of grows so that that person knows somebody else and they vouch for you, and you prove yourself. So over the last few years, I worked with a lot of non-profits around Europe because you have mutual respect for journalists, whatever. So I did Offshore Leaks, and then that really kind of started me working on cross-border. Can you hear me?
No, you speak louder.
I think your mic.
Put it on the other
Yeah.
one. Louder. Let's speak louder. Let's speak louder.
Connect
worry
it to your
about
nose, that's it.
Pretend you haven't got a mic and speak louder.
Yeah.
So, is that better? Okay, well, I'll just shout. So after Offshore Leaks, I began to come up with story ideas, and often the things that I was most interested in involve people in Italy or people in Romania. And naturally, if you are from the UK, then you work on things like corruption. Then the UK is an integral part of that because it's like the front door to all kind of financial fraud and corruption anyway. So I get a lot of people coming to me asking to join projects so that I can help them out with financial understanding of financial money flows, things like that. So I worked on, what did I do after that? Main thing I did after that was there was a cross-border thing on deaths of workers in Sochi Olympics, which was with Stefan and Roman and in Russia. Because the main problem, like, one of the big problems as a British person, and I joke about it, but like, we don't speak any other languages usually. And you can't do a project just using Google Translate. You need local knowledge and people who can read documents. So it's important to build up that network of people, and often it isn't really cross-border. Like, you call in a lot of favors, like back and forth, and I think that's how it operates, because nobody really has any money.
But how did you get into Sochi? I mean, perhaps you could tell us about what Sochi was about.
We were looking for stories. We were applying for grants, journalism fund grant, and we were looking for stories to do based on Russia, because there was a lot of material in Russia that wasn't used. And so we were pitching stories about corruption in Russia, and it became very complicated. In the end, one of Stefan's associates at the Romanian Center mentioned that there were worker deaths in Sochi. So we got a small team together to apply for money, and we got grants, and we worked with Stefan's organization and Roman to kind of do this thing, which kind of took a while. I think it took like 9 months or something to finish. And then I did some more stuff. We've done some more stuff kind of since. Like I tapped Stefan up for contacts or whatever. So that came next, and then kind of interest in Turkey. But again, I have interest in stories in all these countries, languages I don't speak. So I have to find somebody else to help me. And it's also very important, I think, that it's probably different for Stephen being a staff journalist or whatever, but when you get people to get involved in your project, you can't pay them any money usually. So if you do, they don't really get paid very well. So you need to bring people in and have them stakeholders in your project, and you have to learn to collaborate. You can't keep things back. You have to share everything and work on a kind of much more equitable basis. And I think that's kind of that's the relationship I have with most people, journalists, whoever.
Oh, that's great. But we'll get into this later, and people feel free to ask questions almost at any point, and we'll have a big Q&A at the end of it. Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for all coming here. It's a great crowd. And please interrupt me at any point if there's anything that you'd like to ask about. I agree with you, Gavin, that in a way, they've become very popular now to imagine these great worldwide collaborations of journalists, and the big media organizations have bought into them in a big way, right? But this sort of idea of collaboration has almost started as an underground thing, which is really about dealing with the various forms of suppression, which means that people cannot report the stories they would like to report in their home territory. And there's something about it is because journalists have always worked together to some degree. When there was Fleet Street, people used to club together in bars in Fleet Street and work
for drinking, though.
For drinking, but also working out how to get stories published that their owners would not allow to be published. But there was something about the fact they all presented the story that made it possible to publish. By and large, the media is full of lemmings, and they will always publish stories as long as they've appeared somewhere else. You mentioned the CIA story. Well, it took me a long time to get people interested in publishing that story, and CBS show 60 Minutes, one of the most famous investigative show, they wouldn't run this story about extraordinary rendition for a long time. They said to me, are you sure these guys are innocent who are being tortured? And I said, well, that's really not the point. The torture is kind of like cannibalism. It's kind of wrong, It doesn't really matter whether they're innocent or not. He said, well, I agree with you, but I can't sell that to my higher executives. And time and again, we've found that actually, by working with other people and presenting the story across a big sort of landscape, and it all sort of popping up in different media organizations at once, you can get really important stories published. And most of the greatest stories, that we all now think, oh, of course I had to publish it, were initially suppressed. And because they involve the change of thought, which is quite hard to develop at the beginning. the way I think about it is a rather sort of juvenile way, but I go back to when I was at school, in school assemblies, which are very boring, and we used to try to disrupt the proceedings by starting up these slow hand claps where the entire school would embarrass the head teacher. But what we worked out was actually, to start this slow hand clap, you only needed 2 people, but they had to be at opposite ends of the room. So my mate would go to the back of the room and I'd go here, and if we started clapping together, soon everybody would join in, you know? Because the point was, it was the power of things coming from different directions. And I first sort of practiced that in anger, again in a rather sort of covert way, when I was in Brussels. I was a correspondent for the Sunday Times, and there were 2,000 journalists there, but most of them were actually being paid by the European Commission in various ways, taking various sort of research projects or whatever. So it was a kind of press that was rather bought, I thought, and certainly they were not covering, because so many people believed in the European ideal, they were not covering some of the basic amounts of corruption that were going on. And these incredible stories we heard at that point, including, for example, a French commissioner, Edith Cresson, who was hiring her hometown dentist to, among other things, to run a research program. And what we did was we met every Thursday evening in a restaurant. I forget what variety of restaurant it was, and we plotted, you know, how we would get this story exposed, and we worked together, because what we realized then, we were all working for, you know, quite sort of, you know, impressive sounding media organizations, which in theory large budgets, but most of that budget was not devoted. It was devoted to entertainment. It wasn't devoted to very expensive, complicated investigations. And there was not the resources, even with organizations that do have foreign correspondents all over the place, they don't really have the capacity for those correspondents to do much digging. There's so much just regular news to cover. You don't have this sort of multilingual capacity. And there was just tremendous power in assembling a team of people who would actually tell the editors what the story was, rather than be told what it was. And we found that, you know, if the story was, say, published, some bit of corruption, published in a British paper, British papers, even all 8 or 12 or whatever they are, publish that story, they'd say, the Brits, just another, you know, bunch of Eurosceptics, you know. But if it was published in Le Monde, Le Soir, on ARD, El País, all together, they would call a press conference, they'd react, and they'd be forced to investigate, and new facts would emerge. And, you know, the result of that investigation and all the sort of ripple effects that came from that was that the entire European Commission resigned for the first time in its history, and I think perhaps the last time as well. And so I saw the power of that. And again, I was just one part of this team, but I saw the effect of that. And again, on the story of rendition, the CIA rendition, again, as I mentioned, it was something of a story that in a way a lot of journalists knew was out there, but it was really the struggle was to get it published and to find a way to tell that story in a compelling way. And that way it became, in the end, around this being able to track the CIA's planes and their rendition flights all over Europe, which really took off. But even now I remember that really there were, in the end, thousands of journalists who wrote about the story, but very few actually dug up new facts and were prepared to sort of move it on.
Could you describe how you found that information?
Yeah, well, I mean, I did some work on my own, but then what broke it, if you like, was quite a lot of collaboration, and most of it sort of unspoken. But I mean, it was informal. It was before the age of, say, you know, consortiums, or before I was part of any consortium anyway. So there was a journalist in Pakistan, Masood Anwar, I believe his name was, and he wrote a story and identified the tail number, the plane number of a plane that was that had picked up a prisoner in Karachi by the Americans and flew it home. And he's one of these journalists, just put everything in the story, and that was good because it gave us a concrete detail. And that was picked up by a Swedish journalist, Fredrik Loren and his team, who was in Swedish television, and they made a documentary about the case in Sweden, about the expulsion of a group of Egyptians back to Egypt by this team that had arrived in this plane. And I wrote, fun enough, and their documentary came out at the same time as I wrote a piece in the New Statesman magazine called American Gulag. At the time it seemed quite over the top, but actually in hindsight, just about right. You know. And the and by coincidence, we came out at the same time, and I'd done that based on just talking to sources, because that was at the time it was a story that a lot of people wanted to talk about, but nobody wanted to call what it was, which was torture. We found out about each other's thing, and I phoned them up and realised that that they had something, which was a piece of information, a tail number, and we picked up on that, and then another collaboration, which is still rather, incredibly unspoken, which is a collaboration of a source who rather cared about these things as well, who was able to tap into European air traffic control records. And together we were then able to map out the whole picture and identify the CIA's fleet and work with a number of journalists. And the important thing was, the story would get cold. And it would get cold not because there were new stories to tell or new facts to uncover, but because the media would get bored. And they'd say, well, we've done that story about torture, but, the things only have traction. You only change things through journalism when everyone is absolutely bored to hell with you, Think about Andrew Jennings, the friend of mine who's a journalist who read about FIFA, and Sepp Blatter. People are absolutely bored to hell with his stories, I mean, oh my goodness.
Over 20 years, yeah.
20 years, but he just kept going. And sometimes there's the great power of international work is you can, tap into you can roll from one country to another and essentially force the agenda to keep going. And I worked a lot with colleagues in Germany, again, who then picked up on the fact that the planes flew through Germany, there were bases there, and they started picking up on the story where we shared these flight plans. And then I worked with journalists. I worked for the New York Times, and I worked with journalists in Italy because there was a kidnapping in Italy. And our work was then picked up by, I talk again about this sort of, the interrelationship with sources, because then the magistrates in Italy then picked up on all this. And then there was a big development because we noticed and we wrote about the planes having flown through this island of Mallorca in Spain. And then the local journalist then, at a tiny local paper, said, this is an outrage, and they phoned the local police who raided the, on the spare week, I can't get that done here, but over there, they raided the local airline office of the sort of air operators, seized all these records, and all of a sudden we had the names of all the CIA personnel who were actually on board these flights, who were then, with German TV, tracked them down to their homes in North Carolina. But across all that, what were the lessons that you draw from that? One was it was cross-jurisdiction, because there are certain things that you cannot do in certain places that you can in others. We all have restrictions and different ways of operating, which can hold us back sometimes. So, for example, one of the things that the Swedes did, which was very, very impressive in my view, was they hired this CIA plane. They ran back. They picked up. They saw that it was owned by some sort of fake company, and they rang up and said, we come exploiting the fact that intelligence agents never quite say what they mean over the phone. They said, we represent a certain agency in Sweden. They didn't say that agency was Swedish television. It was, and we would like to use the same plane again for another mission. Anyway, they recorded that, and then they got a phone call back from Langley, saying, you sure you know what you're doing? Yes, oh, absolutely, yeah. And then they got a phone from the Swedish security service saying, I think which division are you in? I don't recognise your phone number. Anyway, but they proved the case, and they had it all recorded, in a way that at the time everybody was, the hard thing then with these intelligence stories is to pin things down. But they were able to operate in their space, to use sort of undercover methods that probably would not be allowed and certainly were disapproved of by, say, for example, the Washington Post, which would win various awards later. But they moved the story on, and I think that's one of the powers of what we do. And I could say a lot more, but I'll stop for now.
That's great. Thanks, Stephen. Good. Karina.
Thank you. I'll go backwards rather than from the beginning to the end. So I'm basically a data journalist who specialized in transparency, data analysis. I've recently just joined Greenpeace UK. My colleagues are here in the room. And I've served some time at CIJ learning all the methods that I know from them. And I've taken part in 3 large cross-border projects, the last of which is SwissLeaks, where I was in a particular ideal type of scenario where you had a large team in various countries on the planet, all with specific tasks, working on a specific chunk with some control from a center that will tell you what to do, what exactly is expected from you, and very well-informed data editors that would work with you through the knots.
What was the substance of the Swiss material?
So we were looking at records, leaked records from HSBC in Switzerland.
HSBC Switzerland.
HSBC Switzerland, which contains information, well, client account data. And my job was to take 100 of them and connect various account clients to other accounts, try to figure out how much money they held in reality, through which parties, how many assets, what kind of transactions they were making. So there was a bit of that done by the data researcher, and I was the auditor, otherwise known as the fact checker, having to reconstruct all that network and try to pick holes that the others might have left behind. So just looking at people like Michael Schumacher, for example, which is a VIP, or John Malkovich, but also at serious blood diamond fraudsters from Africa, keeping their money there. Also finding clans or dynasties that held pharmaceutical companies and how much money they had through various relatives. And it completely changed my perspective when I go into a pharmacy now. I just see, oh, that's, I shouldn't buy that because. So that was Swissleaks. And going backwards from there, I was at some point working for Thomson Reuters, but the foundation side. The foundation does humanitarian-driven news. And my cross-border projects there were mainly technical. I had to lead international surveys into a topic that had to do with women's rights. And they were mainly data-driven. We would create everything from the concept to the structure of the data, all the way to the analysis and cross-border reporting through all our correspondents across the globe, based on the results that we got on our surveys. And the surveys had to be done according to social sciences methods in order to be done ethically. Not many newspapers, I don't see many newspapers doing that. So quite proud of being part of that team. And just to go to the beginning, I'm sort of newish to this brand. I started my first cross-border investigation in 2011, published 2012 with the Black Sea. And we were looking into the gold mining lobby and revolving doors. We started from a whistleblown document. We were trying to prove it was real. And because in one jurisdiction where we wanted to send FOIAs to find out whether that was real or not, the system was opaque, it forced us to go internationally and become experts in freedom of information in 5 countries. I did that in partnership with an Irish journalist.
In case there's people who don't know what a FOIA is.
Freedom of information, apologies. So it forced us to learn transparency laws in 5 different jurisdictions and go. One was EU, one was Romania, the other one was the US, Canada, and the UK. And learn transparency laws and try to get different bits of information that would show a machine behind a company trying to push the development of a gold mine in Transylvania, Romania, where they also were planning the building of the largest cyanide telling ponds in the EU. So we ended up luckily publishing with the Black Sea, which appreciated the project also because my then employer, who was a Romanian national, very soon after we interviewed the CEO of the Romanian subsidiary, who screwed up really during our interview, put on their website the logo of the mining company, and I resigned very quickly after that because I didn't want to have to do with to do with a publisher. They wouldn't talk to me about what's been going on at their end. So there's a lot of elements involved in the gold mining story, but there's 3 very different projects. I'm happy to talk about any of them depending on what you're interested in. Yes.
Going back to Swissleaks.
Yes.
Hang on a second.
Could you hold on a second? We'll get a microphone to you. Right.
Here we go.
Oh, well done.
Hi.
It should be, it comes up towards the back.
Yeah.
Going back to the Swissleaks, could you
Yes.
please explain how you collaborated with the other team of journalists from other countries?
Yes.
Was it only through the ICAJ, which meant you didn't have any direct contact, so it was like working on independent stories, or were you aware of the bigger picture?
Right. So I was aware of the bigger picture at all points. So what happened is that in December 2014, I left the Thomson Reuters Foundation. On that day, the ICIJ contacted me, say, we've got this project. We need a fact checker, an auditor. Let's interview you for it. And three days later, I was working on a whole bunch of data. What the ICIJ did was to set up a virtual newsroom. You would have some software through which you could analyze the social networkings. They had a big, large database through which I could search based on name or ID number or some sort of code that the programmers had set aside. I had data from 96, 97 that I worked with. So I would get a number of profiles, number of names, a list of names from Mark Abra or Emilia Diaz. They were my superiors in that sense. And they would say, this is the first bunch, go ahead and see what's happening here. And I'll also get the results from a data researcher from a different country. We're all working around the clock. It was an international project. We're about 136, 140 journalists working on it. It was quite large. So the guys in Washington did something very clever. They set up this virtual newsroom where you had access to other people's work. Other people's work was also visualized. And we went on chats a few times a week just to see what the problems were, what the questions were, what the results were. Every single thing, every single finding was linked back with, this is where I found it, this is how I found the proof for it. This is where I found something was missing. Hey, this is a nice story. Maybe the press would like to do it when we share the results with The Guardian and who else wrote about the story in different parts of the world. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Were they all encrypted? So as far as this virtual newsroom, how was it protected?
I think they had encryption at the back end. With me, I used Tor to research various dubious names online. So I used Tor to protect myself. I was working from the luxury of my bedroom, right? So
That's
yes,
often the most secure place.
Yes, there you go. So you don't really want a nasty Russian oligarch. Not that they're all nasty, some of them are nice. But you don't really want one that's actually nasty to find out, oh, this person is searching my name online. So I used Tor to hide my location. And everything else was pretty much okay. We use an encrypted way of mailing information with a two-step key. And that was that. I didn't feel threatened at all. But I didn't tell my husband what I was doing.
Okay, we're open for questions. Anybody who's got a thought. Yes, in the back.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I have to declare an interest in that I am an HSBC shareholder. I have seen Cressonism. It hasn't gone away in Brussels or other places, and I've seen how it can destroy an organisation. I would draw in relation to the point about the UK as the front door for corrupt financial flows to the BBC Radio 4 File on 4 of 2 weeks ago, and I know the producer was here recently. And in relation to Stefan, what worries me is why some international law enforcers who should know about something don't, but Stefan does. That's why we need people like Stefan. Quick question, do you all reckon that the problem that was raised in relation to the European Commission, and I suspect many other organisations, of a bought press, do you think that problem is getting better through your own work and those of others, or is it getting worse? I wouldn't like to comment on worse or better, but I do believe it is a very, very real problem. And more power to your elbow. Thanks.
Stephen, you want to talk?
I think it's hard to say if it's getting better or worse. I mean, as you said, the problems continue in Brussels. and I think that
Can you speak up a bit? Sorry.
the problems continue in Brussels, and that there's always a confusion between being Eurosceptic and investigating corruption. You know, for me, it's completely two different things. But I think the wider problem is that there is this ungoverned space. You know, we've created global mobility and global communications, but for various good reasons. People don't want a world government and a world FBI, but that means that it's kind of left to informal networks and formal ones as well. But collaborations, be they collaborations of prosecutors or collaborations of journalists, if you like, to skip those jumps. And when I was working as a Europe correspondent and travelling around a lot, is to find that it was so much easier for us to sort of take a file from one prosecutor, and go over and to another country and ask questions there than it was for the prosecutor in Belgium to legally transmit that to another jurisdiction. So there's great bureaucracy, and governments are very afraid to admit their own weakness and powerlessness on a global stage. I mean, the truth is that on many issues, for example, regarding financial flows, national governments have very little power, but they're so embarrassed to admit it and act on the consequences of that to create the mechanisms to trace the money. So, for example, it takes a matter of hours to move money between 12 different companies, which you've all created in one day, and get it around. And it can take 12 months to catch up and follow that trail through all the jurisdictions, either for journalists or even for a prosecutor, all the powers they have, unless there's some sort of high-profile case and everyone sort of rushes in. But the problem is this stuff is routine, and we sort of try to sort of fill the gap. But it's only all we're really doing, I think, and I think that Stefan particularly, and this is it's a Romanian theme, but quite rightly so, because there you've seen this tremendous work at dealing with organised crime networks which span Eastern Europe, and where the governments, there's been a great openness created, but it's been openness for crime, and there hasn't been at a government level anything to match what the journalists have done to connect the dots. But all the journalists can really do is just highlight these problems and give examples, because you take the HSBC leaks, for example. You find some examples there where there's a bit of information. It was a leak. It's only a partial point. Of some. It's only one bank amongst all these other Swiss banks, all these other banks that are hiding the money, and you can just find a little example and make a point from that. But if you want to start the other way around and say, well, I know this guy who I think is doing wrong, and I've got all this evidence, and I want to look at his bank account to follow the money, people quite rightly say, well, you're not actually a judge, and you don't have the right to go and inspect any bank account you want. So that means all we've got is little examples to prove the point, and nothing replaces the need to actually create much greater transparency at a global level to actually stop some of this stuff.
Stefan, go ahead.
I'll only comment that you touch an important thing, talking about European Union, European Commission, and so on. What I'm seeing in Eastern Europe, at least, it's first, I don't think many people understand how these networks actually work, first, and how they get financed, right? And in Eastern Europe, as I said at the beginning, you only have so much financial resources. One is to work as a freelancer for Western media, but that means that most of the time you work in helping others find information. So you can't really pitch your stories or your 1 year or 2 years long investigations. So other people put money into that. So at this moment, unfortunately, there is only the solution of grants, small grants, big grants, whatever. And most of them come from the various European Union bodies or European Commission structures and schemes. And these people operate with, first of all, with a design that was invented in the US at the end of the 60s. The way they think projects, the way they monitor and evaluate the impact of the projects and so on. So they are very focused on quantitative measurements in terms of the impact of their projects. That means they put millions into organizing conferences, trainings, meetings, and stuff like that, but they would never put money into like producing free and independent content or an infrastructure for people to produce this kind of content. So then there are a few others who are supporting investigative journalism, and I'm talking now about Eastern Europe only, because if you go somewhere else like Middle East, Asia, or Africa, or South America, there are different people putting money there. But then you end up in working for governments, basically, right? So either as a subcontractor, or you get grants through a transparent procedure of applying with a proposal, but then there is this huge bureaucratic machine. Even if they are in their goodwill to endorse such projects, there is still this incredible bureaucracy that doesn't actually value your work unless it fits their sort of very old, it's called the logical framework approach. And that I think it's a problem. But then on the other hand, maybe it's for us to find a different way to do this kind of stuff, so not be dependent or wait for grants or for freelancing for Western media. And I think we failed on that quite big because we had only this opportunity and we took it. And that's, for Eastern Europe, I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, go ahead.
How far do you think that ethics are a problem or a barrier to investigative journalism? You've all touched on this to a certain extent. For example, there are some news organisations which don't favour going undercover to do this sort of investigative journalism, but do you think that is a problem? Have you ever got around that in some way?
But they would buy footage if you took it independently. You name any organisation, and I'm sure there is an example where they use this kind of footage if they didn't commission it directly.
Karina.
So, for example, when I work at Thomson Reuters Foundation, there was a policy of not working undercover at the foundation.
That's where I now work, by the way.
There we go. So there was this policy of not working undercover. When I was working undercover for BBC, before we went undercover, we had a strict set of rules of policies, and we had to assess our investigation against that. And if we hit a score below the threshold that would says, "Oh, don't go there," then you could go undercover. There's an acceptable amount of deception that you can practice. I think that's it's actually an official term. And if you go on BBC's website, you can actually see their standards as well. Ofcom as well has a standard for ethics, and I welcome you to click on their website as well. And we also practice it at GP UK. I haven't done any undercover work. I'm the data analyst there, but we're going to do investigative journalism, and that it doesn't have to do, investigative journalism doesn't have to do with undercover necessarily. It's parts of it, but you can do deep digging in public records and connect the dots that nobody else does. It's still an investigative process. You don't have to become a detective, Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, but in some, most of the countries in Eastern Europe, you don't have the body of work that you have here. Like, there is no prosecutor going after the big guys. There is no police work. So you don't have any other option in some cases but go undercover.
And to find the evidence.
Yeah.
But the threshold is really low, because a particular organisation, I was aware that when I was giving a talk about investigative journalism, that even setting up a fake LinkedIn account, you remember, was a problem, because if it doesn't, you don't have to interact with anybody, but just so that you remove your footprint from just basic checks. That was a big ethical problem, because you are I mean, I didn't believe it, but you are representing yourself as somebody who you weren't. I disagree, and that's like, that minimum level, I mean, for that organisation is really very low. Whereas you know that sometimes you skirt the line of ethics to get what you want often. But
speak for yourself. There is a problem with accountability within any group activity like a collaboration, and there are sort of, if you like, things to really watch out for and protect if you do get involved in a collaboration. And you have to make sure that you're accountable for what you do. If you get together a group of people, obviously there are people within there who may behave differently, in which you may not approve of the way they operate. And so you have to make sure that within that, if you publish something based on something somebody else has collected, that they've collected it in a fair way, and it can't become some sort of crowd where you forget the other side of the story, you forget the proper way of approaching a story, and actually hearing, doing good journalism and hearing the other side of things. And that can be a real danger. You can become very sort of partisan and imagine that somehow it's kind of us versus them, we the sort of journalists versus these bad old people, rather than actually there is also a value in diversity. Rather than all coming together, you can have a crowd view. There's also value in the independent voice that challenges. So you've always got to, I think, be wary of all just being sucked into one point of view.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So actually my question, I guess, leads on from that, which is you've all spoken very passionately about the benefits of cross-border. It'd be really interesting to know the kind of risks or potential pitfalls that there are, particularly how you kind of formalise the contractual kind of element of working with different people. If you're not at liberty, if you're not an editor, how do you synchronise the fact that somebody else might publish in front of you, or if somebody's interpreting things differently than you are, how much can you control the kind of body of work that everyone's coming up with at once?
You want to have a go at this?
I will not stop. So, disclaimer, because I started a year ago a PhD at Westminster on how cross-border networks actually work and if they are really networks, and exactly following this sort of direction to see also, the bad side of the networks. And I find that one problem is that this kind of networks end up being small organizations bottlenecked somehow at the top, and you miss a lot of opportunities because you have a centralized structure. And you have a centralized structure because you want to make things work and you want to move on and finish the project. And all these huge projects, I was involved with Offshore Leaks for ICIJ, and I was running the Eastern European Research Hub with 25 journalists. There were possible many good stories there, but they were just not international enough, or they were not just interesting enough for the people at the top. So you had there a lot of maybe missed opportunities. Yes, the journalists would publish in their own country, but as I said before, that doesn't have impact. So if you have a bigger group publishing those issues, would have been much more helpful for the journalists. So I don't see any existing network dealing with cross-border investigative stories dealing with this issue. And then you start to have fights over who controls the network, basically. And then people who are not, people who still are journalists and critical about it, they are sidelined. So you have a happy crowd of 100 people maybe that don't question much the whole network direction. And I think you can easily go towards what Stephen was describing because of that.
Journalists often have, usually have enormous egos. They want to they want to be the guy that got the big scoop, right? So there's always a little tension there, people who want to be the first. So it does involve an awful lot of trust, and you have to work out ground rules of how you do it. Back in Brussels, we had a ground rule which is, people got their scoops. If you got a document, you publish the story yourself first, and then. But then you shared the background material, and the sources were shared as well, with their consent. And that was a basis for working, where people still got satisfied their editors by getting their sort of first story. So there needs to be a high degree of trust. As I said before, there needs to be a level of accountability. So you don't just blame some other reporter in some other country when something goes wrong. You have to check things yourself. You have to remember that, you know, not to become totally partisan. And lastly, I think these days as well, you also need technology for this. There's a lot of trust involved in sharing huge amounts of material. And, you know, with a great deal of surveillance going on and interception, and some of these projects being quite sensitive, you actually need to put in place and work with people who can secure the material and provide means of, you know, encryption and whatever, so that people can, you know, safely and also with confidence share material.
But I wanted to ask Stefan about his research, that if when you have these centralized structures, is there a tendency to kind of put as kind of second class certain regions or countries, so that obviously Western, that kind of Europe is given more prominence, and that so they then forget that they're actually the impact in smaller countries, because I mean that was the main issue with WikiLeaks, that it had such a big impact in these developing countries. But is there a tendency to, in your research, to ignore?
That's a rhetorical question.
No, I don't.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I find these cross-border networks to be a very elitistic thing. It's a trend, it's a hype, but think about how many of these cross-border, big cross-border collaborations are published every year, and in what countries they have the impact. And coming back to what you were describing about the WikiLeaks documents that are not in English, how many of these big cross-border networks start working on a batch of documents in Russian or Chinese or Arabic?
Exactly. I would just say, too, that in answer to that question, that the WikiLeaks is a very good example of one problem with it. Because if The Guardian, for example, tried to negotiate a complicated exclusivity deal with WikiLeaks, they then found that they had never told the progenitor of these documents, Julian Assange, that they had made such arrangements. So the arrangement that WikiLeaks had made with The Guardian was that The Guardian would publish together with El País, with Le Monde, Der Spiegel, with the Washington Post, with the New York Times. All those were nominal agreements that were being made. But however, they decided, however, with the exclusivity issue, that that was much more important than any ethical problem about sharing this material with other newspapers. So The Guardian, in all its great wisdom and profundity and liberalness, decided simply to publish it all themselves, which they did, and to claim credit for it. That's why there's not a single person associated with WikiLeaks who works now for The Guardian. They've all moved to Brazil and other places, lest they be smeared with the same brush. But the complications of that were enormous. It meant that people didn't trust each other anymore. It meant that fundamental trust had been violated, particularly in the case of one author in The Guardian who wrote a book about WikiLeaks, in which one of the chapter headings contained the entire coding system to protect that material from the secret police. But because of the vindictive nature of this curious transactions that developed, that they were able to publish without any difficulty a code which enabled every gangster, secret police, tyrant, any lunatic to get all this material to use it against other people. And that's a real problem with this kind of trust when it doesn't exist, really. And I mean, Stephen was very accurate at one meeting a few years ago about precisely this problem. And I think that it's something we ignore at our peril. You have to work with people, when you're dealing with sensitive material, with great trust. As our Mexican friends have discovered.
But
so
data does very strange things to people, to journalists. And the few projects I've worked on with big data, it's like a soap opera often. There's an issue of propriety, and it causes a lot of complication. I think people are learning to do it better, definitely, but it works better in smaller groups.
Can you give an example?
No, well, I mean, there are always, there's like Stefan said, there's an idea of like, when you push the idea of a collaborative project, so, 20 journalists, 10 journalists, 30 journalists, 150 journalists, it's essentially also a PR exercise, because nobody says, actually, this, at some points, was crazy. Like, it's now a bunch of people don't talk to each other, and that kind of stuff happens. But unless you talk about it, it's difficult for people to learn, like, actually what happens, because you're dealing with people who are particularly who have had 10, 20, 30 years of journalism, who are kind of work on their own, and they're used to having that, I think it can create problems. And there are problems, but it's not something that's really admitted to in public. But I don't want to...
I mean, I think, Gavin, you raise a number of important issues, but I would just say that they're not here to represent their... You talked about various things that happened to The Guardian, and they're not here to describe their side of the story, so I don't feel that comfortable going into that whole saga. I would just say that was there is an element, this is all, there is some real new element to all this. Is handling these huge dumps of material. I don't think, it is really unprecedented, and there is definitely a kind of learning process going on, not just about, not everyone has learned, but there is learning going on of how to deal with the sources who bring this material, and also how to deal with the fact that the material is not just about one country. Its value is in all the places that it where it comes out. But there's been all kinds of squabbling over this material because it's dominated the headlines, and people have all wanted a piece of it, and been left out of it, or been not got the credit they deserve, and all that sort of thing.
But I agree with Craig on the point that if you work in smaller teams, it's much better, especially when you work with data, because even if the people at the center are good-willed, say you have to pass through several filters as a freelancer, and I have a lot of that experience, then if you pitch a story that you find, you may just discover a month later that they've done it without you, if you haven't been credited or involved at all in that story. And again, working with friends, and I've worked with everyone on my right, and I would work with Stephen anytime. It's thank you. There we go. So working with friends really helps, or if you're just starting in a new team, just going in with an open heart and forcing everyone to become friends in a way, that really, really helps. Otherwise, as a freelancer, you get pushed aside, and although your story is there and they get credit for it, you'll never see it with your name on it, and which is depressing.
Okay. Go ahead. You. Microphone. Oh, all right. Go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks so much for speaking tonight. It's been fascinating listening to each one of you. I was wondering, today the Home Secretary, Theresa May, announced some counter-terrorism measures. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, specifically in relation to online censorship, and if you could foresee any problems for international journalism or even domestic journalism because of these measures.
Yeah. You want to talk about it? I think the context of the question is interesting, because there has never been a period in my long time in journalism, in 40 years, where I've seen anything like the surveillance, the censorship, the omission in the editorial process that now is completely commonplace. So it's the idea that there's a new steps being taken to prevent journalists from doing what they're supposed to do is almost bizarre, because they've been doing it now for several years and nobody thinks anything of it. What's omitted from stories is much more important than what's censored, and that's the reality, I think.
But I think it's nobody in the UK can really lay claim to the fact that they are in danger from stories. Okay, there's a libel issue, definitely. But in terms of other countries, I have an interest in Turkey, where they have locked journalists up, and they do frequently use, they label them as terrorists. If you write balanced stories about the PKK, and they're doing it quite aggressively now. So the answer is I don't know, but we don't live in a world where that's a genuine risk. We have one risk, which is apathy of editors or lack of balls, or we have libel, and that's it. We don't come from a world where we face real proper realities that other journalists do every day and still do the work.
Just to go on slightly further, that we have colleagues who are now in Berlin who can't return to Britain, and they're journalists. They can't return here because of the threat, apparently, from the Metropolitan Police of being charged with conspiracy. And when our lawyers ask, what is the conspiracy, They're graded with, we can't tell you. I mean, that's like sort of Paraguay in 1948. You know, it's a bizarre notion that journalists who are transmitting information, who have nothing to do with even how the information was secured, are being held up and being prevented from coming into the country. You can travel to the States easier than you can to Britain, as Glenn Greenwald's partner discovered. But it's actually quite a serious problem, and it'll get worse and worse, particularly for the reasons you suggested. Yeah. In the back? Oh, sorry, you were down here. Go ahead.
Yes, Patrick Cahoon. I'm first time here, and I think I'm right in thinking that one of the main aims of the Frontline Club is to deal with corruption. Am I right? Mm. And corruption is a huge issue all over the world. And I'm particularly interested in the Romanian angle because I've been there 76 times now. And
thank you.
Yeah, I counted.
It's more than you, right?
And indeed, corruption is an issue. And George Soros' Open Society Foundation institution, or whatever it's called, they did a survey of corruption in the EU candidate countries in 2002. And it said that in all those countries, with one exception, Slovenia for some reason, corruption in healthcare, while not necessarily the biggest corruption, affected more people than any other single form of corruption. Hmm. Therefore, I think we all need, including you lot, a strategy for how to deal with corruption. Because you've got to get it walking on 2 feet. Mm-hmm. It's not just an idea. And I would like to see Romania be the former communist country that leads the way out of corruption. And it could happen in healthcare where there should be the least corruption of all. We're supposed to be a caring profession. And an advisor to a former Prime Minister of Hungary told me how it started. In the early 50s, the Stalinist leadership of all these countries knew they needed doctors, decided to pay them like road sweepers and encourage the population to give them bribes, which had the wonderful effect of putting all these intellectuals on the wrong side of the law, so they could put political pressure on all of them. And this man who told me was one of the student leaders in '56 and the advisor to the former Prime Minister. But I would like to see you get a strategy somewhere for dealing with corruption in a particular area that can be contagious, have vision for these countries and for the people involved. And there's a fantastic Indian company in healthcare called TransAsia Biomedical that is absolutely won't pay a single rupee anywhere in bribes. And it was written up in the Transparency International's 2006 Global Corruption Report, which had its centerpiece as a healthcare. And there are opportunities, but I think you need to get a strategy, because you're all talking about different things in some ways. And so do get a strategy, and I'd like to work with any of you who want to do it, because I think we could have a major explosion in Romania that could set the pace for change in Eastern Europe.
Your comment trigged the memory. When I started the project on gold mining lobby, I sent requests for all the correspondence between the mining company and the Romanian presidency, containing a certain word. And they said they cannot keyword search a database.
Do you think things are changing under the new president?
I have to FOIA again, and I'll let you know, but let's just do that, and let's just take it all the way to a lawsuit if they give us the same answer.
Okay. We have somebody back here. Go ahead.
Hi. You've all shared a really interesting experience and perspective. I actually have a question for Craig, who's had experience in Russia, and I can only imagine how hostile to be working in Russia, considering that they have this atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia towards the West. So I'm intrigued by how do you overcome, if you have that language barrier, how do you overcome that, especially since, how do you ascertain that the information that you're getting is truthful or correct and you're not being fed by, I'm hoping I'm framing this correctly, and how do you manage to earn their trust to report the news truthfully? I mean,
well, okay. Yeah. Stephen might be slightly better. We had a journalist there, Roman Anin, who works with Stephen as well, and I trusted Roman. I didn't go to Russia. That's kind of part of the cross-border experience as well. It's kind of cheaper in the sense that you already have somebody in that country. so you don't necessarily need to go there and take a fixer and talk louder or whatever to communicate. I mean, it's anyway. The data information that you get, you have to verify. We had, I mean, I guess the one story was the dead migrant workers. That was very difficult to get information, but we had like a dozen sources, I think, for that story, and it was still we didn't get it all. I couldn't nail down an exact number. I just knew that we just had kind of rough estimates from different countries. I didn't believe the number that the Russian state gave us, because it was way too low. It was less than the number of people who had died in Moldova, for example. So, but the whole point is that you're finding information that is counter to the narrative of the state anyway, or companies in a issue. But I don't know, maybe Stephen has done a lot of Russian stuff, so maybe he can.
Well, just say with your general point, which I think applies in other places as well, is you were saying about often ending up working for Western media organizations. Well, the model has changed, and collaboration is part of that. In that, you know, when I started up, you know, working on Fleet Street, you would work with foreign journalists, and they would be called fixers, even though they were actually journalists, and they wouldn't get a single credit. You know, of course they'd be paid, but there weren't organizations like Frontline defending their interests. The Frontline Club and their charity, you know, when they were killed, there wasn't that level of equality. Now that equality hasn't. It's not that everything's equal now, and there's still that sort of inequality of the way journalists in other countries are treated. But part of the model that's emerged is much more collaborative and gives much more recognition to the local journalists, and there's a lot of trust there. And they are also, it's part of the accountability as well, so that most media organizations now are giving, you know, putting the names of the journalists, not always on the top, who are working with them in these countries. They used to call them fixers, now they are fellow journalists in other places. But that's also sharing the accountability, so because those names are there, and mutually, by having your name there, it's part of also the reliability process, because they're standing up, putting their name to something and saying, it's accurate. So you're relying on a lot of local knowledge and tapping into that, and local courage as well to get your story out.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, hello. I have two issues that I would like maybe you to comment on. The first one is to do with corruption and corruption. There is big corruption and small corruption. Like if you go and bribe your GP just to be seen earlier, or you'll be maybe less damaged than you pay in America, or going here to a dentist where you pay lots of money and you still have to wait and things like that. So just to go and film somebody because they pay like a little £2 or something just to be seen earlier, that is maybe a form of corruption, but it's completely different from macro big corruption that has, tax dodging in the UK, or financial finagling and things like that. So if you can comment, on like dangerous corruption and just maybe, little things that gets often published. And the second issue is to do with the editors, like you said, the censorship and on meeting of a lot of facts. And I would like to know how is taking place that the editors continue to publish a lot of falsifications, a lot of, tampering with the truth, and they seem to be getting away with that. Just, that the stories that we're reading every day are not true, and they're falsified, fabricated, and recreated, and with all sorts of fixers and fractures of stories. They get away with that, but we never get to know the truth of what is corruption, what is reality, what's going on. So maybe you can start commenting a bit of. It's quite philosophical, but yeah.
No, it's a whole other meeting. I'm afraid it's a massive subject, and you couldn't be more right. The difficulty is when people talk about it, the general assumption is if they deny it's true, it's true. If they say it's not the case, you know it probably is. So we all operate on that supposition. As they used to say in the muckrakers tradition in the States, that any government lies. The question is only what the degree is. So we operate from that supposition. One other hand, I think, over here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
There was a point made earlier about the difficulty of tracing information. Stephen's example about 4 hours, 12 bank transfers across borders, and then it takes a year to trace it. And I thought that the implication there was that it would be easier and great if that were made easier, for example, for members of the press. Wouldn't that be a double-edged sword in the sense that at the same time you could have people who are not bona fide members of the press, but they have a press pass, because that's not very difficult to get, isn't it? And then they would use such, let's call them enhanced powers, to find out stuff that actually deserves privacy. So in a way, you would be demolishing indirectly and as an unintended consequence precisely the sort of thing that many people militate against, which is, data protection and sort of confidentiality.
I don't think that corporations should be private. They have the status of, they call them legal persons, and they have all this sort of protection, and they also have liability, which they can borrow lots of money and never pay it back. Of course, there's a trade-off, but I don't actually seek any right. I was always trained in that, really, that we, as the press, should never ask for more rights than the members of the public. So I don't think, I'm not in favour of any special rights. I think all this should be open. And the problem at the moment is that one of the reasons there isn't openness offshore, for example, is that the use of offshore tax havens and lack of transparency has become an integral part of international finance. So all the hedge funds and all the other financial instruments use as part of an ordinary business the same methods and jurisdictions as the fraudsters and crooks, and they have to be separated out. But at the moment there's a tremendous lobby against that because of the way that the financial system works.
But in the back there, you yourself, yeah. I'm afraid this will be maybe one more question, but that'll be it. Go ahead.
So I recently did some investigative journalism for the BBC Regional Current Affairs programme, and obviously you've got councillors in towns all across the country, everything's in newspapers, and it felt, in hindsight, compared to a lot of the stories that have broken globally, pretty, should we say, safe. And now I work at Sky, where we recently did a thing called The People Smuggler, and it was Alex Crawford chasing the guy behind North Africa people smuggler. And there was a bit where she was interviewing the top cop in Libya, and she sort of said, "What if you had this guy? What would you do?" And he basically said, "I can't confirm who this guy is. I haven't got any resources. I don't necessarily trust the prosecutor." And it was as big a case of anarchy as you can imagine, really. I'm curious to know those two contrasting elements, so we say Britain brackets Europe versus anarchy. Which one is the most conducive to getting your investigative journalism done and surviving as well, I suppose?
I would say something interesting I wanted to mention after Stephen's point about how the police are kind of a little bit behind, definitely behind crime, in the way that crime is transnational now and policing isn't. For example, when we did the mafia story, a mafia in Africa, and I'm working on other stories about mafia, and there are so many instances where people, the laws, because the laws aren't the same in each country, nobody can ever get, if you're Italian mafia and you disappear to Africa or the UK, you can't be extradited because they don't have that law, like Mafia Association. But in terms of things like data, I spent 9 months trying to get the tiniest piece of information from the National Crime Agency, 9 months just to get them to confirm that they had seized assets of an organization which was owned by one of the mafia families in Italy. I called a colleague of mine. It took me like a month to get her to do it, but when she did it, within 2 hours she had 150,000 words from the prosecutor, of documents, of all the transcripts of wiretaps. They just gave it all to her, and it took me 9 months to get the National Crime Agency to give me the tiniest, and they wouldn't even give me the case number, or the court that the assets were seized in. So there is an issue in terms of Europe and the UK. We're very secretive, and we don't like giving information out. And that's
where was the other location then?
Well, it was Italy, but there was a bunch of other countries throughout Europe. But as Britain, we're really not. I mean, cops can't even talk to journalists anymore without.
But speaking about anarchy and security, a subject that you raised, just think of Yanukovych leaks, if you know the story, how the journalists actually got divers to go in that lake and get the documents from the bottom of the lake, and then they spend loads of amount of time drying them, scanning them, and analyzing the corruption they found there. They've just won another award last week at the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. I mean, they're all alive and well and partying like hell last week. There's not a problem. At the other spectrum, there's a lot of very safely from behind your desk done investigations that we're doing, and at GP, just watch the Energy Desk. We're publishing quite a bit this week and the coming weeks. You can do that. You can do it from the comfort of your home in a very civilized, non-invasive, and very safe physically way. So I don't think there's necessarily a problem between the two, but there are definitely certain environments that you might want to consider your safety, but we're not there, I think. None of us.
One final point perhaps about that is that we tend to forget when we talk about these specific personal relationships with police that surveillance is a huge internalized and secretive function, which makes it very difficult for the person you're dealing with to know who you are and what you represent, and who that person is you're talking to, and who they are and what they represent. And particularly if you realize that everything you've said, done, electronically and digitally in the last 7.5 years is being lodged in Utah right now. Every single bit of even detritus, electronic pocket lint as they call it, all of that is being stored. So the ability of somebody to sustain themselves in a private way is almost ridiculous under the circumstances.
Can we get the Swedes to rent that place?
Quite right.
Yeah.
Just saying, conclusion. I just think that we are there to do stuff where others fail. We're not prosecutors, and we shouldn't be. And therefore, it's bound to be the case that in countries where the system's completely broken down, that you're going to have better access because people are going to turn to you and hand you the documents. If they've got a police force that will do this stuff, it's quite normal that you wouldn't expect to get the same sort of access. But do you want to live in that country that's completely broken down?
Hopefully, yes.
But
for the story, yeah.
Go ahead. Just to finish on that and come back to that question on privacy, I live in Eastern Europe, and people with money can get hold of this data anyway. So if you have money in Eastern Europe, you can order someone's phone to be tapped. You can order a database regarding customs, import, export. You can order bank accounts, transfers and stuff like that. If you really have the money and you really want to do it. So I think the amount of data out there available to, like what you say, governments and also private people with money, it's really huge. It's already there. I think, myself as a journalist, I'm always in this schizophrenic position where I would like to see all these databases and get all this kind of information. And most of the time, I do get it, I do see it, but I totally understand the other side, where if this data is kind of out there for everybody to see and connect and put it together, well, it might end up bad for some people.
I think with that, I'm afraid we're almost at the end. Can we have one more? Okay, go ahead.
Just following on from that, I was recently talking to a retired senior fraud officer and talking about money laundering, and he was basically intimating that once it goes through the data trail and it goes through, let's say, through real estate, or the money has actually transacted, they go through a particular cost-benefit analysis saying there's no point in actually prosecuting or taking it any further. So I guess the question to yourselves is, do you also go through a process of cost-benefit analysis as to what point do you spend time, effort and resource in trying to find the your end goal, if you like?
Myself,
In
I have
general,
no money to
in-
start with, so that's not. I can spend time. I can dig onto sort of parallel directions.
But I think most
few
people would
years.
agree that there's a social interest, there's a public interest in large sums of money or large bits of political influence, and that's what we're after as journalists, and not small sums of how much you append a policeman in a small dark alley somewhere.
But I think you have a point, and that's a big difference between what journalists doing this kind of cross-border collaborations do. And there is no cost-benefit analysis.
So, I mean, you'd be prepared to spend 10 years or, you know, X number of years.
It's not like
to-
you work 8 hours a day searching through various databases the same name over and over again, although you can do that for a while. You have some usual suspects, you have some targets, people, entities, whatever, and you are focused on that, yes, and you are focused on that more than a year, maybe. There are projects that I've been doing with other journalists in Eastern Europe that took longer than a year or 2 or 3.
Well, sometimes you put it down and then pick it back up.
Yeah.
You know, so
Like
you-
most stories.
You get to a certain point where it goes dry, something else comes up, you do that instead, and then that happens a lot.
And then there's a grant. The Journalism Fund in Brussels, for example, I think sponsor both Craig and I on different investigations, and they do funds for cross-border reporting. But there are different funds. Some would fund you to get an editor as well. Some of them would fund you to get travel or a lawyer. But it depends. But there are ways of not going completely bankrupt and desperate. You're on your own.
And when you take their money, eventually they want you to produce a story, so you...
Exactly.
But I think we're much less, by the fact we're very small in what we do, and we don't have the resources, and we're much less methodical. And of course, and there is an implicit cost-benefit analysis, but we just pick on some examples of things we can't investigate at all, just to shine some light and hope that people might make a broader investigation out of it.
But with that, I want to thank everybody on the panel a lot. That was really terrific. Thanks so much.
And also that our members' club room downstairs on the first floor is open if you want to have a drink and carry